say some things?
So far this morning, I've had some coffee. This is thus far incredibly strong, but quite nice.
It's very nice. It's not as bitter as the one that I had last night, which was a bit like, oh god.
Yeah, that was
Too much.
coming at you. That was
That
like the
was
rapé
really-
of
that
coffee,
was-
wasn't
it
it?
was.
That was like
That was extreme.
coffee. Kind of nice.
Special midnight coffee. I
Special
reckon.
midnight
Keeps
coffee.
you wide awake.
Hey, what's up? James Jesso here. Adventures Through the Mind. This is episode 100, which feels like a pretty big accomplishment for me, actually. And given that it is a centennial episode, you'll have to forgive me because, well, the intro might be a little bit long. Longer than usual, anyways. I've been trying to keep them under 5 minutes recently because I want to talk a little bit about this podcast and, I don't know, something to mark this time in the podcast, because it does feel like quite a big accomplishment for me now that I've been making the podcast for a few years. I want to talk about why I started it, why I invested so deeply into it, and what it's brought into my life over the last few years. At that point, I will introduce this episode to you because it's a pretty complex one because it has multiple guests actually answering 3 different questions, but we'll get to that in a second. When I started this whole psychedelic thing, I started it with as many of you might know my story, the desire to heal myself, to fix issues I was going through, namely depression, anxiety. And eventually that led to some positive resolution, and then it led to the sort of, I don't know, like the quasi-megalomaniacal commitment to writing a book, to like whatever it was, some sort of like championing something or other, which led to all these public talks, which led to multiple books, which led to like speaking all over the world and really feeling held up and honored in this positive way for the contributions I'm making to this field of research and to this culture. And partway in there, I thought that it would be interesting to start a podcast for multiple reasons. I was really inspired by what I was learning from different podcasts that I was listening to. Ones that I don't actually listen to anymore, but listened to pretty heavily at the time, like the Bulletproof Radio with Dave Asprey, and Rewilding with Daniel Vitalis, and something about the conversations they were having. It just felt so powerful just to listen to these conversations, and I thought, I'm a good conversationalist. Let's give this a try, and I figured, what the hell, might as well. And so I also thought it would be interesting that it would give me an opportunity to basically have direct conversations with the people who inspire me and whose work I've, been really moved by or has made a big impact on me. And so it was like this weird, not so altruistic / altruism, like, oh, I could positively benefit psychedelic culture and do good, what I believe to be good work in the world, while also getting to benefit from these opportunities to just talk with amazing people who inspire me and have a reason to get them into a recently increasingly closer to 2-hour conversation with me, and to allow me to, for the most part, just let my mind go wherever it wants to go and ask questions about whatever it is. And it's really been incredible to see how, in the beginning, I was pretty inconsistent about it. If you go back, they also weren't very good. They were just audio, and then I moved to audio and video, and a lot of these were recorded in my parents' basement, actually, because I had moved away from Alberta, where I was living, and into my parents' basement, first to get settled, and then a series of events sort of led me to not being stuck there, but deciding to stick around there and to work a job while also investing all my time and money into releasing The True Light of Darkness and then establishing this podcast thing. Because I saw that then all of a sudden there was this opportunity for Patreon, and I thought, whoa, what I just thought might be a really cool idea, a really cool project to bring into the world might end up becoming a means by which I can make a reliable income, a fairly steady income, and work full time on what I see to be my work in the world, which includes this podcast and the other things around it. And yeah, so I started to commit to it. I wasn't super committed in the beginning, and then something happened. I think it was in 2016, maybe it was 2017. I realized like if I want to, earn the trust of the people who are, participating in this show, like participating as listeners, to earn their trust, to earn their respect, to grow my following, to grow my income, obviously, I need to prove that I am trustworthy and consistent. So I committed to a 2-week, once every 2 weeks schedule, and have stayed committed to that, despite sometimes it being very difficult, having to do like 6 episodes in advance and have them all packed in and ready to go while I'm, out of the country or something. But yeah, I started taking it very seriously, and as I've taken it more and more seriously, I've come to like understand and even have respect for myself more so than I initially did. Because at first it seemed like a cool idea, but increasingly more so, it feels like something meaningful and respectable. I remember not that long ago, I was doing a new business card, and a friend of mine said I probably shouldn't put podcast host as one of the things that I was on my business card, because it seemed juvenile. And that was like 2 years ago, and advanced 2 years, and I feel like that's an honorific title at some point. At least at this point in time, I feel like becoming a podcast host, especially a professional one, I see how much energy and effort and skill it requires, and I have a lot of respect for other podcasters because it's tough. It's not tough in a way where it's like, oh, boo-hoo, it's so hard. It's like challenging and invigorating and exciting and sometimes very stressful. But yeah, so I just feel really good. And I especially feel great that there's a growing number of people who directly support this podcast, and have made it possible for me to, have moved out of my parents' house. Like I saved up a bunch of money, and then I got out of my parents' house to try to, light a fire under my ass to push me to the next level of my career, and watched my bank account just go boo, as I work towards it. And thanks to people, possibly like yourself, if you're a patron listening now, or someone who's given PayPal donations, like Julie, Kevin, and Jules recently. Thank you very much. I've watched myself steady back out and start to grow again, and grow in a way that allows me to do things like invest in the new camera and this mic that I'm using, which I'll explain in a second, and eventually, a new computer. And yeah, I just feel so honored that people care enough about what I'm doing to give me money to do it. I mean, obviously, I generally ask for something the equivalent of a cup of coffee a month, but there are people who give significantly, like more than $50 a month, and have been for like years. Like, that's crazy. I mean, like, I thank you. I mean, don't stop, but like, it just blows my mind that someone can care so much about what I do to put that much of their financial energy and their hard work, which that's where that money comes from, is their hard work, into my hard work, because they believe in me and what I'm doing. And yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's been you guys, not just the high investing patrons, but you're like everyone who listens to the show. It's been because of you that I've felt empowered to keep doing this, because I keep getting this positive feedback of like, hey, this is valuable, keep going. So I just want to thank all of you, because we wouldn't have gotten to 100 episodes if we hadn't, if I didn't have your support. So thanks, like huge thanks. So a little inside story before we get into this, because it's episode number 100. Episode 1. Peter McCoy, Radical Mycology. Surprisingly, still get a lot of listens on that. I think it's terrible. I mean, in the sense, like, Peter was great. I think I was terrible. I had the idea that, I'm a pretty good conversationalist when I smoke cannabis. I should like get stoned before this interview. It'll probably go better. I was so awkward and felt so confused and at some point I felt like I had no idea what I was doing, and I was just kind of leaning back and trusting Peter to hold it together. I've never done that again because it just like, yeah, I mean, maybe I will sometime. Maybe we'll do like a podcast, like a cannabis infused podcast sometime. But yeah, so it's that is a little inside story. So if you listen, I wasn't just a poor podcaster early in my interviewing skills at the beginning. I was actually stoned and awkward and so uncomfortable and like so insecure, uh, which compared to the podcasts I've been doing recently, I feel grounded and present and like this is what I do. And I do it well, I believe, and that I continue to self check and get and use critical self-appraisal and the critical and the constructive suggestions of people who listen to try to make it better and better and do better and better. And yeah, it's great. I feel amazing, that this has become a career and a reliable one, because when I was just selling books and doing that whole thing, I would essentially like make a bunch of money selling books, touring around to festivals and other places and like slinging books out of my backpack like a drug dealer or something. And like, I'm sure anyone who's gone to festivals knows what I mean when I say like the festival drug dealer, but like with books. And books about psychedelics. It's funny. I bet some of you have had the experience of me walking up to the camp and you being like, is this guy selling drugs? And me being like, you want to see what's in my bag? It's books. Anyways, I would like get the stockpile of money and then it would just slowly dwindle down to nothing and I'd be almost broke, and it was not functional. And now I feel like I can invest in growth and my health and my life and like the ongoing, like, I don't know, like, invigoration of this podcast because of the reliable income my patrons offer and the donations and the growth of people buying my books because they've been exposed to my work through the podcast. So it's like, I just feel so blessed. I really feel blessed. And I want to celebrate that. I know I'm rambling a bit, so I'm going to drop this here, but I just want to express how grateful I am and how blessed I am for everything that you, the listeners, have empowered me to achieve over the last few years, over these last 100 episodes. Okay, so let's get into this episode 100 of Adventures to the Mind. Last year, I believe it was last year, 2018, I went out with my Canon camcorder and a shotgun mic and started doing interviews with people because I had this amazing opportunity to be connecting with all these psychonauts and luminaries and researchers, people on the cutting edge and the front lines of psychedelic research and psychedelic culture. And I thought, like, wow, what better time to just drop in? Everybody's brains are so alive, especially at OZORA Festival. Everyone's brains were so alive because we were all learning from each other and talking with each other. And then there was that like feeling of the temporary autonomous zone that festivals bring and like the sharpness and the curiosity that it awakens. And I felt like, I'll get some interviews. And then, so I got several, and then I got a few, and then I got a few more outside of the podcast or outside of the festival as well. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with them. I knew I was going to make a podcast, but they were just sitting for a little while since last year. And then I was like, whoa, the 100th episode, let's do that. Let's make that happen. So this one features Julian Vane, Nikki Weird, Kalindi Iyi, Muru Baki, Mariana Dinkova, Rosalind Watts, Lior Roseman, and Marta Kechmarchek, answering 3 questions. The first question is, what is the most relevant use of psychedelics at this time? The second question is, what does psychedelics show us about what it means to die? And the third question is, what is an area of topic, or what is something that's missing representation in the larger psychedelic discourse that deserves that representation? each person is going to introduce themselves in the beginning. I'll give you the structure of this. Each person is going to introduce themselves in the beginning, and in the same order that they introduce themselves, they will answer each question separately. And each time a new question is presented, there will be a tone, and then the first person to talk, it's like the same order each time, and each time the first person speaks, it will sort of reiterate the question so that you'll know where we're at in the flow. And also the sound quality, I mean, I was doing it with a shotgun mic at festivals and in different places. It's variable. I've done my best to even it out. I've even chosen to use the same shotgun mic that I used to record these interviews here now, so there wasn't like a big disparity in audio quality, so it's all about the same. And yeah, so some of it is not great. I mean, not what you're used to, because it was wild on the ground. And a credit to everyone who's spoken this. Unlike some documentary films, I got interviewed for a documentary once, and unfortunately it didn't get released in the documentary, but I had to repeat things over and over and over and over again to get it right. But each of these people, it was just like question, first answer, boom. So all of this is single take, one off, on the ground, you know, like right there in the moment, like, hey, can I ask you some questions? Yeah, sure, here we go, record. And a particular reference to, especially if you're just listening to this in audio, there's a weird sound in Leor Roseman, this like rising and falling weird sound that is actually the infant child that he's holding snoring. And then I included a moment of some crying in there because it contextualizes it. You'll see what I mean. But that's the only thing that's like obviously like, what the hell is that? Everything else is obvious. Like, that's house music in the background, or those are people walking around in the background. So yeah, I personally feel like it was cool to get these interviews because each person, each person answers the question slightly differently, and there's a real dynamic of answers as well. We have clinical researchers, people who are just like high dose psychonauts, other people who are occultists, and other people who are event organizers, and so it's a cool dynamic. That's it. Okay, so that's the introductions. Huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon, who I already thanked. Here are the people who are giving significantly. It's on the screen. It's also written in the description below. Those of you listening, please consider becoming a patron if you have not yet. Help this show grow. Get involved with the cool community of patrons. Get your name listed on the screen. Additionally, you could leave a PayPal donation. Links to all of that are contained in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, as well as wherever you are watching / listening to the episode, including other support options like buying t-shirts, buying books, buying blotter art, buying limited edition art in general. I really appreciate that, as you know, if you listen to the whole intro at the beginning. That's it. Enjoy this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, episode 100.
My name is Mudu Baki. I'm an educator, advocate, psychonaut, and entrepreneur, amongst other things.
So I'm Rosalind Watts. I'm a clinical psychologist at the Imperial Psychedelic Research Group in London.
I'm Nikki Weird, and I'm very interested in the whole field of psychedelic research. I spend my time doing things like I'm the director of Breaking Convention, which is a biennial conference that happens in London, multidisciplinary. I also edit the Psychedelic Press Journal, which comes out every 2 or 3 months. And I proofread and copy edit lots of works on psychedelics, philosophy, and various other topics. That's my day job.
I'm Leo Roseman. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm finishing right now my PhD in Imperial College London under the supervision of Robin Carataris and David Nutt. I'm doing a lot of the MRI work in the lab, both my work and the rest of the lab helping a lot. And I'm continuing for a postdoc soon over there. And this is Ibanu, baby boy. Who are we doing all of this for the future?
My name is Mariana Dinkova, and I am a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I also organize medicine retreats to Peru, in which I combine my work with the work of indigenous shamans and indigenous medicines, mostly ayahuasca and San Pedro, and I also do journey preparation and integration sessions for people all over the world.
My name is Kalinda Iyi. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I cultivate mushrooms, I do martial arts, and I lecture. I'm here at the OZORA Festival giving an interview.
My name is Marta Kaczmarczyk, and I'm a co-founder and the coordinator of Psychedelic Society of the Netherlands.
So my name is Julian Vane, and I'm the author of a book called Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony, and a bunch of other stuff, mostly to do with occultism and magic, which is what I tend to write about, as well as psychedelics.
The most relevant use of psychedelics in this time, for me, personally, I think is the redefinition of what it is to be human, the reprogramming of the human psyche or the operating mode that we live under currently, to open up options that there are other modes of existence, and ultimately the personal journey, which is the self-forgiveness, healing, and empowerment. And it's something I think everybody needs to have an experience with.
So we have a mental health crisis, an epidemic of depression. It's now the #1 cause of disability globally. We also have an ecological crisis, and I think that these two things can be worked on together at the same time with psychedelics as the major tool. So I can either see a kind of downward spiral where people become increasingly disconnected from nature and increasingly depressed, using commercial consumer products to try and make them feel better as a short-term numbing of the pain that we feel on an existential level because the planet is dying, and also because we're disconnected from ourselves and each other and spirituality. So we can either go on a downward spiral where we consume more to numb the pain in a short-term way, and we become increasingly disconnected and we destroy our planet more and more and more. And there are eco-psychologists who believe that actually depression is linked to, on some kind of collective unconscious or unconscious level, this awareness that our planet is dying and what that does to us, even if we don't realize it. So we can either go on this downward spiral, or we can go on an upward spiral where a psychedelic experience can give people this sudden, people that have never been interested in nature can suddenly have an insight into being nature, not just enjoying nature, but actually being part of nature, part of a cycle of nature. This feeling of being part of a system, they're not lonely anymore, they're part of a living, breathing system. And being part of that system and knowing that you are nature can be an incredible reboot. And obviously with the psilocybin effect, which can lead to improvement in symptoms of depression too, people are more likely to go out into nature, go for walks. I can see an upward spiral where people care about nature more, they want to protect nature more, nature starts to flourish a bit more, people start to get all the mental health benefits of being in nature. There are so many, from just touching grass every day, looking at trees, even looking at a picture of trees can have improve your mental health. So I think a symbiotic upward spiral of nature connectedness, general connectedness, will help us with the epidemic of depression and the ecological crisis, but they have to happen in tandem.
I would have to ask you a question in return and go relevant to whom or to what, because that presupposes some kind of thing that we're talking about as being relevant. I think possibly what you're asking there is about the sort of the most important, the most interesting would be how I would interpret that question. So I'm going to answer that, and I would say that the most relevant use of psychedelics is the research that's being undergone to do with depressive states. For me, that's the most interesting thing, because that's one of the hugest problems that we have in our culture, are people that aren't excited about life, that feel that there is no hope for them, and that everything is it offers them no opportunity whatsoever. And I think people that are in that sort of chronic state of depression because of the world around them, if they can be excited by psychedelics into the incredible amazement of the world around us, then I think that would enliven them enough to actually do something about the rest of their lives. So for me, that's the most relevant use.
Yeah, it's hard. It's kind of like, I think nature and community are both the things that I kind of feel are of importance. And I'm going to just talk about community, but I'm not really sure what is more important. But I think the part of the adulting of the psychedelic community is to learn, the importance of like the community of the other or the other in that space. So, people or go to festivals or go to ayahuasca ceremonies and they confront with a group. And although some of them come from like a self-healing kind of intention, in the end they go to a group setting. And I think a lot of learning happens in these group settings about really meeting the other, accepting the other, compassion to the other, and the importance of like the group energy. So these group peak experience can be very, very powerful when they're experienced as a group. It doesn't always happen, but when a group peak experience together, it's something very powerful about teaching us about the potential of where we can go as humanity. And I think that's part of what's going on right now in the psychedelic community, of understanding how to utilize these tools with more intention towards like community building. And it doesn't necessarily have to build a community, but you can go to a session, learn something about the importance of community, and then go back to your life and look for it in your day-to-day life, because it was so profound at the moment.
It's hard to say, I'm biased. And also, since one of my favorite medicines to work with has been ayahuasca for many years now, I would say the most relevant use is learning to love and honor the self, which is the most important things people get out of it, and then on each other. It's amazing to see what amazing powers for people to forgive, ancestral healing, forgiveness to people who they were always holding trauma or resentment from. And basically it's about freeing the heart for love towards oneself and towards other people, and to see the divinity in each other, which then it's in a way the biggest safe proof against war machine and against self-hate one can imply, and that goes in both directions.
I think the most relevant usage of psychedelics in our time is to explore consciousness. That is the first and foremost and most real usage of the psychedelics. It's primary. Medical reasons, psychological reasons, all those things are secondary and tertiary. First and foremost is to explore consciousness.
I think the most relevant use of psychedelics is to combat mental illnesses, like depression or anxiety, though people should be careful and remember that psychedelics on its own, they're not magic pill, and they should be assisted by some sort of therapy or guided by a person that knows what they're doing. They should some sort of like preparation session and integration session should be included as part of the experience.
I'm always interested by questions that are framed around, the biggest, what was the strongest trip you ever had, that kind of stuff. Because I think that one of the interesting things about psychedelics is they're about multiplicity and proliferation. So the most important use, there are many most important uses at this current time, and that includes everything from the safe embedding of psychedelic experience into festival environments, supporting people in that in different ways. It includes the medical discourse and addressing the real crisis needs of individuals, looking at how psychedelics might be used for things like conflict resolution within group therapy settings, looking at how we might empower ourselves to produce our own psychedelics, because we know that things like the exploitation of the resources to create ayahuasca, socially and environmentally, that causes issues. So to try and find ways of creating medicines for ourselves, so things like growing mushrooms and getting the technology of that more widely understood by people, that's really important. I think that the idea that we now have the scientific or the contemporary research into the way that psychedelics work for things like problem solving, so to introduce psychedelics into those environments where we have to solve real world problems, engineering problems, mathematical problems, those sorts of issues. So there is no one most important thing. The point about psychedelics is they proliferate into multiple realms and multiple worlds. They touch upon lots of different aspects of the human experience. So we are advancing outwards on all fronts simultaneously, and that's what we should be doing. So we should be keeping the medical discourse alive, the post-traumatic stress disorder, MDMA psychotherapy, and we also need to be working very hard for the democratization of these experiences, their accessibility, and the permission for people to engage in them in a host of different ways, privately, recreationally, in ceremonial context, for specific outcomes, and that's what we need to be doing.
Well, I think the psychedelic experience basically shows us that death is more of an illusion than anything else. because you experience yourself outside of your body. I mean, it's an opportunity to experience your pure consciousness and realize that that voice, that consciousness in that space is the voice that you've been listening to for as long as you can remember and will continue to listen to. So for me, it was a reassurance that no matter what you can do, you're not going to shake your own consciousness, your own awareness of me being. Now, what vessel or what type of existence me being will exist in, no one knows. But I think the psychedelic experience proves that you will always be experiencing something, for lack of a better word. And there will never be a time when you won't be, excuse my grammar, but you won't not experience something. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. So to me, it's evidence that there's a self that will transcend the physical always.
One thing that first springs to mind is that I think one of the things that people are afraid of with dying, we all know we're going to die, it's the great certainty, it's the one thing we can all rely on. I think one of the things people are frightened of is the pain of death, the actual physical feeling of suffering. And psychedelic experiences can not only prepare you in a way for the psychological pain of letting go, of your ego dissolving and letting go of your normal sense of yourself and feeling that you're drifting away. It can prepare you for that. So it's a practice run when you're safe and you're healthy and you have other people and you're not actually dying, so you can really go into that practice knowing that you're actually safe. But I think the other thing it shows you, as well as the practice of the pain, it also gives you a taste of the bliss. People are frightened of the actual physical pain, and psychedelics can give you this experience of such beautiful, gentle, calm, ecstatic bliss that I believe that is what will happen to us after we die. So after the physical pain of whatever physical, actual bodily issue it is that actually leads to our demise, that following that there will be a beautiful, beautiful, blissful feeling. And that for me reassures me that actually no matter how painful it is at the time, bliss will soon follow. And whether that's just because we know what DMT feels like and we think that DMT might be released after you die, or whether people have spiritual beliefs about going to some place where they feel blissfully accepted and everything is fine, and all, you know, they look through their life. And I mean, I've heard many people saying that after their psychedelic experiences. But even if you don't believe that, I think that this physical feeling of bliss is very, very reassuring. And also evidence from near-death experiences suggests the same thing, the kind of the white light, the feeling of bliss, the feeling of everything being okay. That for me is hugely reassuring, and I think other people as well.
Okay, so I've had a few experiences on psychedelics where I've gone offline, as it were, consciously. And sometimes from the outside it looks like I've also gone offline in a more sort of physical sense. Obviously I didn't, because I'm still here. And for me, the process that I went through on those occasions was one of relaxing into the sensation of stopping. And for me, that made me feel much less anxious about potential pain associated with death, which is obviously a worry. Like, if you just stopped existing, you wouldn't even notice. So it's about the trauma of death is the thing that I think people worry about. And so if you can experience going through a traumatic experience and from the inside it feels less traumatic and that you could in fact deal with this, then the actual fear of that moment of approaching death would not be so intense for people. I think that the other thing that psychedelics do, because they make life so important to you while you're actually on them, they intensify that lived experience of breathing, just the ground underneath you, all of those physical sensations. It makes you appreciate life so much that you feel that you won't be cheated when you die. You feel that you have lived.
I think it shows us something about how respectful we should be for the process of death and also the process of birth. But it teaches us that like dying might be that intense altered state, and the way people die right now in our society is, not ideal for this mindset. And I think you only die once, right? So like respect that moment and give it enough kind of the right setting for it, So it's mainly learning about the setting of dying, I think, and how to die in a nice way. Yeah. Oh. Oh. Let's get. He didn't like us talking about that.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, I thought that too. Right? Yeah.
About what it means to die in my personal experience, as well as in the experience of quite a few of the participants of my retreats, as well as from the many psychonauts I've talked to, is that it's a natural process, that we totally know how to do it, that the bigger part of us is on the other side, can never be harmed. It, from my experience, the psychedelic experience actually so much reveals that date is another gateway and not like a finite thing, and that most of us is beyond this body and beyond this lifetime in many ways. So it was one end reassuring, and at least for me, I died my very first ayahuasca ceremony, and it was like, wow, that's what I've been afraid about. So in many ways, it takes away the fear, and on the other hand brings a different kind of determination, because if you're living life not because you're afraid of death but because you are engaged with it, it's a whole different paradigm.
It gives you a chance to practice death, be able to go into exotic novel realms, as you will ultimately go into a novel and exotic, weird, different realm at the time of death, because there is no such thing as death. We're just using that as a metaphor for the next phase of our journey, our sojourn through the multiverse.
So psychedelic experience, in my opinion, offers a kind of view back into like the history of when our ego structures were not fully there, and so sort of like we could say they put us back into childhood. Therefore, we can view emotions we had when we were children, and when some like conditioning was written into us, and therefore we can work through trauma and we can change the programming we have inside. And for me, ego death and like sort of like dying through psychedelics actually is that kind of like going backwards through like our age. So like going to the childhood, or maybe even like a prenatal state. I believe that, for example, the experiences on ayahuasca or DMT, where you experience this like oneness and full ego death, is the state from like either before you were born, so like some sort of prenatal experience, before you kind of started to have programs written over you by your carers.
Ooh. I guess on a pragmatic level, I suspect that the experience of dying, for many of us, depending on the nature of our death, the way that it arrives, may well feel like a psychedelic experience of some description. We know that there are similar, at a neurochemical level, we know that there are similar pathways that seem to sort of become active, or we know that things like ketamine and various other substances have perhaps relationships with the chemistry, the physiology of death. So it may simply be that taking a psychedelic allows you to prepare for death. We're all going to have this experience. And depending on what our views are about how we might persist somehow after death, or have an infinite moment of experience at as the oxygen leaches out of our brains, perhaps having some awareness of how that feeling may feel, that may even comfort us. May even a common experience with psychedelics is that people realize that in a sense, there is no death. This is one of the great sort of insights that's recorded from the initiates of Eleusis. And I think that psychedelics may teach us something about what it may be like to die, but they may also teach us that death appears to be, certainly from a psychedelic vantage point, just one of many possible transformations. And I guess it maybe makes us less conscious of our own death as a finality. And if you look at things like terror management theory, which is a field of psychology that looks at what the impact is on human culture of the knowledge of our own death, what tends to happen is that human beings tend to be, they tend to withdraw and to take up comfort in symbols of nationalism and identity and all sorts of things to sort of claw back a sense that when they die, they won't really die because their nation will carry on, or their ideology will carry on, or they'll go into some sort of religious afterlife or whatever it happens to be. And I think that when we get to sit better with our death, we become perhaps more compassionate, perhaps more inclusive of other beings. And I kind of like that. So I think that the psychedelic experiences teaches us a way to be alive in relation to death. I think that's the message that it seems to have for me anyway.
Well, in large part, you're looking at it. No, I'm joking. I would like to see more, Black and Aboriginal people get back to it because they've been so traumatized, whether through colonialism, post-colonialism, for these practices. I really like for them to be able to embrace it fully. One, as a tradition that belongs to them, and two, as something that is not harmful to their existence, and it's not to be confused with so-called narcotics or the drugs that many minority communities have been afflicted with. I'm happy to be in an event like this with so many enlightened white folks, to be blunt, because it really shows that we could build an intercommunal existence with each other. And so I would like for more of our people to come to spaces like this and understand that, yes, they are different types of white folks out here. And some are just genuinely good human beings that are on this path with us together. And the more of us that experience that, the more times we share our shared experiences, the more we have a common relation beyond nation, politics, favorite soccer team or football team. It'll be something deep and abiding on a spirit level. So I think that's the beginning of empowering these communities and reconciliation, because at events like this, what I see is that the majority white crowd obviously recognizes the traditional approaches to these spaces, and they respect them to certain regards. You see some expressions of course, what they call cultural pimping, but for the most part, everyone here is genuinely respectful and acknowledging of both their own Western culture and other world cultures experience into this altered states. And so I just would like more of our people to join in so we can, one, share the traditions that we have from our past, two, learn about traditions from other people's past, and three, kind of create a movement against this global suppression and oppression, in which we can work in a community and not feel like you just have to stick with one particular team and that you can't work in coordination with another team.
Well, for me, my first reaction is mainstream health professionals. Because, so I did my training, my clinical psychology training with 42 wonderful people, all now clinical psychologists. And I know them well, they're good friends. And when I've talked to them about the research I'm doing, and I've been doing it for years now at Imperial, and really encourage them to get involved and come and be assistant guides and get involved, only one of them out of the 42 is interested. And that really amazed me. That really, really amazed me, because I think there is such a stigma, but particularly in healthcare professionals. And that's going to be key, because it's all very well and good about like kind of changing minds of the public and going out there doing talks. But often the talks we do, because we try and do a lot of outreach work at Imperial, but it's also often to audience of people that have depression or that are seeking something for themselves. And of course, mental health professionals can have depression too, but it's usually not the workers that come. It's usually the people looking for a treatment that's effective. But I find that actually mental health workers are often quite kind of defended against it. They work incredibly hard, long hours, stressful work. They've got a clinical model that they stick to, and that they're quite, in my experience, quite kind of stuck on that old model, and that the idea of a new paradigm coming in that's very very challenging to that is hard for them to adapt to. And if those health professionals don't adapt and don't feel more accepting of psychedelics, that's really problematic. So in our last study, we had someone go to his doctor and say, he had treatment-resistant depression, nothing had worked. He'd had like 10 types of antidepressants, none of them had helped, had talking therapy, hadn't helped. Went to his GP and said, I'm going to take part in the Imperial psilocybin for depression study. And the GP said, that's really dangerous. You can go crazy from psychedelics. That's in like 2016. So I just really, really hope that I want to go to conferences, like mainstream psychology conferences, and present about psychedelics rather than always going to the psychedelic conferences and kind of, it's like preaching to the choir. We're all in this little bubble. I really want to start, I really hope that we can start getting representation from the more kind of traditional mainstream therapy models, psychiatry, and nurses from the NHS in the UK and other healthcare systems in other countries, that they can be made excited about it, they can see the benefits of it, and it won't feel like a challenge, because obviously people have their jobs and their livelihoods, and if something else comes in that they're not trained in, it is a challenge. So it's going to be about like managing the transition and making everyone feel included and not scared of it, basically. Well, appropriately scared. You need to be a bit scared, but not too scared.
Okay, so things that are missing representation, there are huge amounts of different things. There is vast numbers of countries that I've never seen represented at any psychedelic conference that I've been to, which could just be because I've been to ones in Europe. But there's huge swathes of Asia which I've never seen represented. Lots of Africa rarely turns up. And there's lots and lots of other countries. So Russia, I think I've maybe seen one Russian speaker. So lots and lots of different nationalities that I don't know about. Something that's very much missing from it, I was thinking just now, what was it? Let me try and remember. So something that is definitely missing from representation is the way that we then integrate psychedelic experiences into culture which is not familiar with psychedelic experiences. So someone goes for psychotherapy, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, to treat their alcoholism or whatever it might be, and they have their treatment and they have integration sessions afterwards with the therapist. But what happens when they go out to the pub or to their friend's wedding the next week and they're trying to explain what's gone on to them? How do they have the tools or the language to develop to integrate it into their ordinary life afterwards, when most people think that psychedelics are just some sort of weird thing that makes you see colours in the sky? Yeah, and that area I've never seen addressed by anybody at all, and it's something that I'm quite interested in exploring further, as to how do we do that without persuading people that they should be taking psychedelics or be involved in it, because obviously a lot of people will never be interested in doing that. They're quite happy as they are. But how do we have a discourse with people to explain to them about in an easy way to understand? And that's something that I'd be very interested in seeing more talks about.
So again, it's kind of going back to that community or the other thing. I think a lot of people in the community, psychedelic community, understand that, but it doesn't really translate into research yet. And there's something still in the discourse, I think, of the psychedelic community, although we understand that the importance of the group or importance of meeting others, there's something in the discourse which is still self-centered, self-compassion. There's certain kind of almost a unidirectional thought of people who use psychedelics, or in general Western spirituality, as if self-compassion would lead to compassion to the other automatically, and all these like self-work would lead to also being kinder to the other. But I believe that should be much more focused on intention of both self-compassion but compassion to the other. And I think working with the intention of accepting the other, compassion to the other, can lead you also to a lot of self-compassion. So it's like it goes both ways. It's not there's just like, let's start with the self. And I think the discourse is still in a way self-centered, and I think there's a depthness of really meeting the other in that psychedelic moment, which is very, very, very profound. And a lot of people, they use psychedelics, and even some ayahuasca ceremonies, you would go and you just go to your internal space, and that's important. But I think there's almost like a glorifying of the internal over the external, and the importance of the internal over the external. And I believe that both are important. And there's always should be an intention of connecting to both the internal and the external. Yeah.
Two of them, actually, thinking about it. And the first one is the one I've been passionate about feeling for many years, which is navigation tools. A lot of people talk about integration by now, but very few people talk about navigation. And then that is when years ago I was so passionate about how comes nobody's talking about it, that I developed my system of tools for navigating altered states, which I speak about everywhere, mostly around ayahuasca work, but it applies for all kinds of psychedelic experiences, and people are welcome to reach out to me for more information. I'm very passionate about it. And the second part is actually that psychotherapy and psychedelics are mostly held in clinical setting trials, but often most psychonauts don't even see psychotherapy as something they're interested in unless full on in crisis mode. And in the other hand, the most beautiful and fast forwarded work I've done with clients is especially with clients who had big psychedelic experiences, or who have had the ayahuasca experiences or come to my retreats. But big psychedelic experiences does, because then you have such an ally in your team as this self who has experienced who has experienced probably way more extreme self experience in both directions, but especially when it comes to unity with another bigger consciousness than us, or than the normal waking life one. So when that work gets combined with personal work, and not just after the journey itself in the form of integration, but also months after and years later, this has been such a catalyst to what transformational work, or in my case psychotherapy, can do for people, and how quickly it can lead to transformation. Because once they've had those experiences and they have them as allies, that version of the self, and those experiences mostly come from psychedelics, be it ayahuasca, be it something else. A lot of people have had them with mushrooms or all kinds of helpers. But once you have them in your memory bank and somebody knows how to work with them as well as work with you, it's such a catalyst. And way beyond just the period of integration after a journey. Because you want those pieces of self to become your best friend. Those experiences of self or beyond selfness to integrate is who you most think yourself to be, beyond any negative self-talk or limited perception of self and what's possible.
Well, the whole in psychedelic discourse is the area that I'm bringing up and that I'm pushing, high dose usage, as opposed to party doses, medical doses, psychological doses, and things like that. The high dose is very rarely looked at because of fear, because of the mechanisms of the administration, the mechanisms of governments, and the mechanisms of holding on to power in not only the medical and psychological realms, but holding on to individual power over people, because they don't have access to extra dimensional knowledge.
So I think that's what's missing, is that the shadow side of psychedelics. Now, like, I feel that the community is mostly focused on praising psychedelics because we all want them to be at least decriminalized. Because we are like all fighting for cognitive liberty. And I feel that because of that, people tend not to talk about like the negative side. And there's so many issues that can come up as a consequence of use of psychedelics. So many people, for example, end up depersonalized for some time, or they end up having hypomania. So they end up like having some minor mental health issues that are like caused by psychedelics, or kind of, maybe it's not by psychedelics, but it's more about facing emotions that were suppressed and not being able to process them on your own. And so, like, if you don't have like a specialist, or you don't do proper integration, you might end up like being more wounded than before, like having like a worse mental state than before you took psychedelic. So I feel that the community should talk more about this, and we should be more honest, especially amongst ourselves, that this is happening, and many people are also stuck in some kind of like dissociated state because of psychedelics, and they use it to like go into this like fantasy world that's not necessarily beneficial for their life. And many people make decisions that are not beneficial for their life because of psychedelics. And also like the community, there's like this sort of like a trend of people like leaving their work and making like big decisions because they thought they like connected with unconditional love, and they feel that they can trust the universe, and then they go on those journeys that are not necessarily ending positively. So we should all like discuss that this might be issue and be more like rational about what those substances do.
Okay, so in terms of the representation of psychedelic culture, I mean, we've got a number of things. How we represent sort of internally, what are our processes. So one of the interesting things that happened yesterday during the panel discussion, the various people on, was that Graham St. John very clearly went out and kind of noticed that there was a gender imbalance in the people asking questions, and kind of said, oh, would any of the women in the audience like to ask a question? So in terms of this internal narrative of looking at where difference exists, where power relationships exist, and finding ways to challenge those, to change those things internally is really important. I guess when we talk about representation, to whom are we representing? One of the things that I think is happening within our culture very, very rapidly, very interesting thing, is how words like ayahuasca are now to be found in mainstream news broadcasts. You know, I saw the astonishing Fox News broadcast about MDMA psychotherapy, which almost seemed to me to be a parody, because here is this agent of news talking about a subject that I'm engaged with, which I would normally imagine that they would be vehemently opposed to. So I think that there are many representations that we make, and going back to the point about diversity, I think the fact that, you know, conferences like, for example, Breaking Convention, where you have medical people, you know, clinicians, you've got scientists, you've got traditional, you know, ayahuasqueros and curanderos taking part in this thing. That's really what we want to kind of continue to cultivate, both internally and externally. Many ways of seeing the psychedelic experience. It doesn't have to be seen as this kind of privileged white, you know, Euro-American male domain by any stretch of the imagination. One of the ways that I like to challenge that is just by talking about the story of the famous archetypal meeting with the West with the indigenous shamanism of Mexico. So you have this meeting with Maria Sabina, and this great shaman, let's call her. And this story is typically told, and if you go into Wikipedia, you'll see this, it's typically told from the perspective of a guy called Gordon Wasson. I'm much more interested in the perspective of the idea that Valentina Wasson, who is this leading paediatrician, tries to take her 18-year-old daughter to go and sit with Maria Sabina and her daughter and take the sacred mushrooms. So I think a lot of it is also to do with us as a psychedelic community realizing that there are many ways of us representing our story both internally and externally. And following up all of those possible threads, there are many people who could benefit from the psychedelic experience. We know this again from the clinical work that's been done, who are, they're not kind of freaky hippies. They're not. They come from other kind of cultures. And what we have to do is we do have to actively reach out to all those other cultures. And there are many people who are really doing this work now, and I celebrate them for doing that.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for listening to episode 100 of the podcast. Woo! Woo! Look forward to bringing you episode 101 in 2 weeks from the release of this one every other Friday. If you like the episode, please share it with your friends. I personally feel like awesome about having all those people share for the podcast. I hope you felt awesome about it too. Please consider supporting the show financially by becoming a patron, leaving a PayPal donation, or buying something from the shop. All those options are listed in the description to wherever you're listening to this, / watching it on YouTube, or at jameswjesso.com/support. Support. Near the end, when I do these outros, I always just like mess up my speaking. But yeah, that's it. I'll see you for episode 101. Thank you for tuning into the podcast. And yeah, take care.